Okay, so we left off on Tuesday discussing this introduction, right, in our sort of broad ethical framework. We reviewed all of our action-based theories, and then we sort of got started talking about the difference between the agent-based theories and those action-based theories, right? Maybe some ways in which they can account for certain moral intuitions we have in ways that the action-based theories cannot, right? But we really didn't get too far into those, right? So we basically just introduced the idea that under our agent-based theory account, and again, this is just an organizational framework, right, that can help us understand some of the key differences. But the idea is that we can classify those into traditionally types of virtue ethics, which come primarily from the ancient world, ancient China, ancient Greece. And then we have something that is classified broadly, again, as feminist ethics, right? But again, that can include lots of different things. But most feminist ethicists are going to focus on something like care or something that's related to the fact that we are relational beings, right? That we're social individuals, right? So whatever the virtues are, right? It could even be described as another type of virtue ethic in some cases, right? But they're giving a very feminist account of virtues, right? Not what they consider to be the more masculine virtues that are present in Confucian and Aristotelian virtue ethics. Okay, so I want to spend some time kind of going through virtue ethics in more detail. I gave you like a hypothetical. I think it was like Sarah and Bob, right, who were offered drugs at a party, right, and a way that virtue ethics can account for some sort of difference between the two in a way that the action-based theories could not. So does anyone want to remind us what is a virtue ethicist able to say in the case of Sarah and Bob to distinguish them in terms of moral praise that the action-based theorists can't? Because they both do the same thing, right? They both act in the same way. And I do want to clarify that the notion of using your will is also language that we'll see in Kantian deontology, right? But for him, as we know, it's really just the action itself, right, that is going to be the bearer of moral praise. Whereas what you're right, the idea is that in an agent-based account, like a virtue ethic account, we can say that there's something perhaps more or less morally praiseworthy. And so, yeah, if we're using virtuistic language, they're going to either be more virtuous or more vicious, right? Again, just on some sort of spectrum where virtue is in the middle, right? And vice is on the ends. So on the one hand, right, someone who just says no to drugs is going to be considered not morally praiseworthy because it's just that. It's just a simple no thought went into the decision, an automatic response based on whatever. So I think I said it was because they remembered some messaging that they received as a kid about how to say no to drugs, right? And so the idea is that all of the rational work, right? So that's something that virtue ethics does have in common with the action-based theories. Again, that's going to be one of the feminist critiques, that it takes a very traditional approach of reason, right? So virtue ethics, you still have to be rational, but part of that rationality is going to involve experience with temptation, in a sense, right? Why must we be tempted to do the wrong thing in order to understand why it's right? According to virtue ethics, give more moral credit to things that are harder. Why do you think the virtue ethicist wants to do that? Right, so there's something that is happening here in the same way that almost happened in epistemology, right? When we're talking about knowledge having this like special status over belief. This happens in other value judgments, right? So in this case, moral value judgments. And so we think that having these moral statuses, right, being a good person, being a virtuous person, doing the right thing, that these are things that are special. And things don't tend to be special if everyone can do it, right? And if it's like super common and if it's super easy, right, and doesn't require great effort, right? So there is an intuition that the virtue ethicists are picking up on here, which is that in order to be worthy of praise, some effort has to be exerted, right? So something that is not going to be allowed in virtue ethics is an accidental they called it the accidental virtuoso, right? Someone who's just like born good and always does the right thing, like just from when they're little and never needs to be corrected, right? The idea is that they don't know what they're saying no to, right? Because they've never bothered to explore the alternative. There's, other versions of this that might lead into a little bit when we did our problem of evil, right? In philosophy of religion, the idea that you need the good for the bad, right? That they're somehow interrelated, right? That's very much going to be influential on the Eastern notion of this as well, right? But the idea is that we have the capacity for both. And so there are going to be things that are going to impact our ability to cultivate virtue that we don't actually have control over, which is why both Kongzi and Aristotle were very concerned with society and politics. Because the idea is, I'm going to use a Confucian metaphor from one of Kongzi's disciples. And the idea is that you can imagine vice or virtue are disposition towards those things. To be something analogous to sprouts, right? So the idea is that we have moral sprouts of goodness, but just like any sort of sprout, it needs the proper environment and care and consideration in order to grow and to flourish, right? Which is definitely going to be more an Aristotelian notion. His goal there is what he calls eudaimonia, which is just human flourishing, right? And the idea is that this is what virtue ethics is going to lead to for Aristotle. Okay, and for him, being a flourishing human being was very much being a good member of society, right? So again, still very masculine, right, in that traditional sense, but the idea is that we're supposed to be, there's some potential in us, right? But we equally have the potential to go the other way, right? So in that sort of idea of whether or not human nature is inherently good or bad, virtue ethics says neither or both, right? It's that we have the capacity for both. And so it's the actions that we engage in that over a lifetime that are going to matter. So not each individual action, but patterns of behavior. And it's not so much that we're judging people on those patterns of behavior, but that it's the virtue ethicists are just describing how this works, right? That when you make decisions again and again and again, when you engage in the same patterns of behavior and over and over and over again, you develop habits, right? And those habits are the things that we're going to be judged as either virtuous or vicious. So the idea is, well, why shouldn't you steal? Well, because you'll become a thief. and the idea is that this is going to be a habit that you're not going to be able to control at some point, right? And that it will grow and get worse and worse and worse, right? And so we judge that habitual progression into vice, right? That is the normative judgment that's being made here. So again, there's a nice aspect to it, which is that it allows for some error, right? It allows people to make mistakes because we're judging people based on a lifetime. However, in order to figure out what's virtuous, again, can be rather tricky because it really just is. The idea is to locate it according to the doctrine of the mean. Does anyone remember what this is? Doctrine of the mean? Sort of referenced it already, but exactly, right? So I mentioned that vice and virtue could be like on a spectrum, right? So when they're listing all of the virtues, they're showing all of the vices on either side of it. Yeah, so let's actually pull those up. Let's see. And here's Aristotle's list of virtues. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Are you guys able to see this okay? Thank you. Okay. So the idea here is that, right, Aristotle came up with a list of virtues, which I already, spoiler alert, right, feminists are going to classify as masculine. Okay, but the idea is that all of human activity and feeling can be generated for Aristotle into these types of activities, right? So he lists them out. It's very organized, but the idea is that, again, it's a spectrum. Either you have too little of something related to this category, you have just the right amount, right? The mean, which means average in this case, or you have too much of something, excess, right? So let's look at one that I think is the most obvious one. Okay, so conversation. This is my favorite, right? So a virtuous conversationalist is witty. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to be witty, right? We know something about how they're obviously going to be entertaining people with some form of communication, but how much or too little conversation is witty? Well, if it's too much, then you've made a buffoon of yourself. And if it's too little, then you've been a bore, right? So again, I don't know how helpful that is, right? Like, does that tell you all what wit is? Does anyone now know how to be witty? Evan, can you impress us with your wit now? So you're being boorish, right? It's too little. It's not enough, right? And I'm probably being a buffoon. It's too much. It's too much for some people, right? So again, there's some very attractive aspects of virtue ethics, right? Some picking up on some things that maybe action-based theories can't do. But like every other theory, it's got its weaknesses as well. And this could potentially be one of them. As nice as an idea as it is, right? This idea of like a balance, moderation between things. In terms of actually using an ethical theory to make decisions, some people might argue it's not the most practical, right? In terms of making a decision. But again, if you're looking at this for the account that it is, which is not something looking at individual actions, you might just say, well, that's not really what this theory is trying to do, right? It's not trying to help us make individual decisions. It's trying to help us become better people, right? And so if you look at the goal in that sense, you might find it to be a stronger account. Okay, so again, there's still a lot we could say about Aristotelian and Confucian virtues. Do we want to look at the Confucian virtues really quick? I think I have those in there as well. Anyone interested? Yes, okay. Good. There we are. Sharing screen. Okay. So here we'll see a similar list of virtues. You're not going to see it laid out in terms of the doctrine of the mean, but the idea with Kongzi is that the balance is going to be between the people who are immediately close to us and the people who are outside of us. And in this case, it's not even actually supposed to be directly equal. So this is something that's a little bit different for Confucian virtue ethics than it is for Aristotelian virtue ethics, because for Kongzi, we are supposed to be giving special treatment for family and those who are close to us. However, I did say that for Confucian virtue ethics, they can conflict, right? So here we see that yi, the virtue of righteousness, means we're not supposed to have biases for anyone except those who are right, but we're supposed to have special or partial care for our family. So those two could obviously conflict with one another. Excellent. Okay, Hannah, your student has a question about filial piety. If parents abandon their children, the abandoned children still have to be loyal to their parents. So this is tricky because in one sense, there are these virtues, right, that we're supposed to be modeling. The end goal of all those virtues, though, is to create harmony in society. And so another part of that picture for Kongzi and Confucianism are the 5 bonds or the 5 relationships, which are supposed to tell us who we're supposed to look to cultivate our moral behavior. And unfortunately, this is always going to be placing older individuals and especially family members in a superior position to yourself, meaning that you're always supposed to defer in terms of moral judgments as well, right? Defer to your parents, defer to your elders, right? Defer to those who have more authority than you, have more experience than you, and things like this. But an implicit part of the 5 bonds is that it's supposed to be interdependent, right? So the idea is that even though there is a inequality between each of the five bonds, right? They're not equal. One is always subordinated to the other one. The person in the superior position is supposed to have a responsibility towards those in a subordinated position. There is a small part of Confucian philosophy that argues that if the leader, right, whoever is in that position of authority, and this could be in any of the five bonds, right, but he talks about it politically in terms of the leader of society, right, which would be the emperor. And the idea is that if they're not doing their part, then you are no longer obligated to serve them. Right? So that, again, conflicts with some other teachings in Confucianism, which is the idea such that, like, if you get into an argument with your parents, you have one chance to what's called remonstrate with them, which is to try to argue and convince them to change their mind. But the idea is that if you're unable to do that, then you don't have the rational backing, right? Obviously, to make your point. And so you should go along with what they say, right? But that doesn't necessarily presume that they've abandoned you, right? So in that case, even though you're supposed to go along with it, it's only because you disagree with them. So the idea is that he will allow for you to break that bond of subservience if the person in the authority position is not doing their part, right? So I think abandonment in terms of parents would definitely satisfy as not doing their part. And so the children would be able to legitimately forfeit any sort of obligation they have or might have previously had towards them. I think that would be consistent with Confucian philosophy. Good. Other questions so far? And the idea is that, right, the elderly individuals the idea is that they're entitled to that because they've been the caregivers, right? Or they've done their part in that more powerful or authoritative role, such that they're right entitled to or worthy of, deserving of that reciprocal relationship. But again, there's going to be discrepancies here that are not as reciprocal, right? And the most obvious of this relates to gender, right? So I can't fail to bring this up because, again, right, it's going to tie directly into the feminist critiques that motivate care ethics. But the idea here is that even in the five bonds, women only appear in one of them, and it's as the wife, which is in a subservient role to the husband. And as we know, the common traditional forms of patriarchy tend to mean that women are made subservient to men at every phase of their life, right? As in their youth, they're made subservient to their fathers. In marriage, they're made subservient to their husbands. And then in this case, right, especially in ancient China, right, really any of the ancient world, when if they're fortunate enough to bear a son, then they are subservient to them, right? And so there's always going to be there's never going to be that reciprocal, for the mother in terms of absolute authority. It's going to be very specific instances where the mother is going to be granted authority, right? So for example, we're going to see in traditional Confucian ritual that women always serve men and then eat after they eat, right? And so there's just always going to be this discretion. There's also a historical physical barrier that relates to the construction of Confucian housing. I'm not sure I've talked to you guys about this when we talked about Confucianism, but traditional Confucian housing is a square, right, with a smaller square inside of it. And the idea is that even within those, there were inner walls, or what they called the inner chambers. And so there was gender segregation in housing, right? Even within your own home. And no men and women were supposed to interact, let alone touch, unless they were married, right? And so there were very specific rules about how you hand something to someone. You're supposed to set like a basket down on the floor, and then the person's supposed to pick it up to make sure that you don't touch, right? And so these were part of the practices that were believed at the time to cultivate virtue, right? To bring social harmony. Yet at the same time, again, Kongzi acknowledges conflict of virtues. And so he says, if your sister-in-law is drowning, You're not supposed to touch her. Obviously, saving her life is more important, right? So forget this rule that you can't touch her. Like, so even he says that these rules are meant to be disregarded in certain contexts, right? So again, there's a difference here between Confucian and Aristotelian virtue ethics in that case, right? Aristotle's much more like, no, they all unify, so it's not as context dependent, right? But for Kongzi, it will be much more that way. I think I have. Right. And on my tradition, as the family biggest person, I have to start and then the small. Oh, interesting. Like the oldest people. Yeah. So size, age, right? We create these hierarchies in families, and Kongzi thought it was for a reason, right? So his justification for this, right? Even hierarchy in the family. Again, the idea is that if we don't learn how to treat each other well, and he did think we needed that structure in order to do so, because remember, we could equally become vicious, he thought, without it, right? So we need the structure to ensure we're cultivating the virtues and not the vices. The idea is that we can't expect people to treat strangers well if they can't even treat their family members well. So again, it's like a trickle out theory of virtue, as well as a trickle down from the leaders, right? A sort of ripple effect starts with the family. So you give preferential treatment to family members, even in some cases, justifying breaking the law, right? So again, even though Kongzi is searching for social harmony, nothing in Confucian virtue ethics is absolute, right? Even not following the laws is okay if it's to protect your family, right? So it all has to work together, but that means that sometimes you sacrifice the outer pieces in Confucian virtue ethics to keep that core, right? And he thinks that that's just because of the way we actually operate, right? He just didn't think it was realistic to expect people to treat everyone equally. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts on virtue ethics before we get into care ethics? All right, feel free to pop your questions in the chat if you have them. Okay, so to review, right, feminist care ethics has taken issue with this specific sort of distinction that we've gone over time and time again now, right? We saw it in epistemology, we saw it in metaphysics. So I'm just going to review it here with you really quickly by sharing my screen, right? One way we can sort of classify the way all of this ties together now with ethics is to introduce a notion which is called hegemonic masculinity, right? Hegemonic means singular, right? So the idea is that everything is the same. And so here, right, in presuming that there is only one type of femininity, it's also presumed that there's only one type of masculinity, right? And again, as has historically been the case, we looked at this with mind and body, right? They're set up as opposites of one another. Okay, so not like in the Eastern traditions where there's this interconnected yin-yang, right? Here it's a duality, right? That there are two individual things that are opposing one another, which means they cannot, right, inhabit the same space, right? The idea is that emotion gets in the way of reason, right? And to be reasonable means to not be basing anything off emotion, right? These are literally defined in opposition to each other. And so what has happened is that feminists have discovered that there are a lot of other things historically that have been associated with these characteristics, right, here and here. And so this association grows. It's not just rationality and emotion that are tied to mind and body or masculinity and femininity, right? But it's also notions of our person, right? So going back to when we were talking about free will, right? We tend to presume that, right, men are a lot more independent, where we tend to assume that women are a lot more dependent, right? We think of women historically as subjects, right? Subject to, right, the decision of someone else, not the one making the decision. Whereas men tend to be treated more as agents who can transcend their animal nature, right? Go beyond, which is why they've traditionally been designated the public sphere, right? We have historically trusted men more to make those decisions because of these types of associations, right? And more so than that, in terms of ourselves, it has aligned with notions of good and bad, right and wrong. And it's not hard to see that historically anything associated with the body tends to be associated with things that are bad. I don't think I need to, do we need to unpack that more? Anyone think that the history of humanity has been kind to the body? Associated it with the good? I'm willing to entertain the argument. No. Okay. Don't want to be pushing the agenda here, right? Seems pretty clear. Okay. So the idea then is that if those associations have been the case, right, then feminists have done their due diligence and gone back through the history of these different philosophies to try to see if the theories that we have accepted, right, what counts as knowledge, what counts as being a rational agent, what counts as being a person, what counts as having free will or autonomy, and in this case, what counts as being good or virtuous. The idea is that have women been excluded from those categories as a result of this implicit association, right? And so as a result, feminists, unsurprisingly, came to the conclusion that yes, right, these biases very much underpin and influence all of the traditional normative ethical theories we've looked at, right? So that's all of the action-based theories and the virtue ethic accounts, right? And so we can summarize their criticisms into three basic problems. The first one is the prioritization, right, of reason over emotion, right? The idea is that the history of moral decision-making has done this, right? And if we can remember our section on mind and body, right, and how this influenced the feminist response and standpoint theory, right, we remember why this can be problematic. Okay, does anyone not remember why this has historically been considered problematic? I want to make sure I review in case it's necessary. Okay. Right, so for some further examples of this, right, there are even double standards when people do express emotion, right? So if a woman were to express a judgment or an opinion, just any proposition, anything, in an emotional way, how are people most likely to respond to them? What else? What else do people say to emotional women? Offer you something to eat, or they're going to ask you if it's that time of the month. I was waiting for that one, right? Mm-hmm. That's the body association right there. Yeah, no reason at all, right? This even gets tied to the notion of hysteria, right? I'll stop being hysterical, okay? Or yeah, overreaction, okay? So all of these things, right? These are responses to not what the woman is saying, right? But how they are expressing it, okay? Whereas when men tend to express emotion, the responses are different. And it will depend on what type of emotion the man is expressing, right? So if the man is crying, it depends. Sometimes they're made fun of. Sometimes we see it as like, oh, if they could make a man cry, then it must be really serious, right? Right? Because women will just cry at the drop of a hat. So does anyone know why that is, though? Does anyone know why girls are socialized to cry more than boys? It's not a biological thing. It's what feminists are going to say is that it's not an inherent difference. It's that girls are socialized to be people pleasers from the get-go. And so for survival, we have to cultivate empathetic understanding to judge the emotions of people around us for our own safety, whereas boys have not had to be socialized in that same way, right? So it's learned, but you're right, they end up having to learn it a lot later in life, which, you know, a lot of people could say is to their own detriment, right? That we're denying them really social skills. And this leads to men not being able to express emotion, right? So in the same way that this historical split has denied women the opportunity to be deemed reasonable, right, and to be deemed moral or rational, it's also sort of classified men in a way that we would contemporarily define as sociopathic, right? If you are never basing anything off emotion, if you don't experience emotion, right, if emotions make you weak, right, which is a very common message told to young men, right, boys don't cry, right? Girls are allowed to cry. It's actually one of the only forms of expressing emotion that girls are permitted to do socially, which is why girls will cry more often than boys, because they'll cry for any number of emotions, right? It's just the only socially acceptable way for them to express it, right? So what has been the socially acceptable way for men to express emotion? We've always had to care and to learn and to know as much as we can about men's experiences. Again,
Right. Yes.
the idea is that that is the case for anyone in a position of privilege, right? We used the example when we did standpoint theory, I think, of a heterosexual man and a homosexual man, right? And the idea that the homosexual individual has that double vision, right? Same thing, because the marginalized group in terms of gender is traditionally women, right? The women are going to have the double vision, the men aren't. It's a symptom of privilege, right? And it's the blind spot that we all have, right? So it's the same with race, right? It's the same with religion. It's the same with class. It's the same with ability. It's the same with any type of way we could classify human identity. And so, yeah, we might say then that if we're going to update some of these virtue ethic accounts, maybe an update to Confucian virtue ethics would be in those bonds, right? Whoever's in the authoritative position has an obligation to learn about the experiences, right, of those who are subordinated beneath them, right? So we could maybe update it in that way, because yeah, it hasn't been the case. And again, this is important right now because there are people who are actively trying to prevent people from learning about the experiences of marginalized groups, right? So there's been an update to a classic meme or a classic quote that I quite like. I'm sure you've heard the classic quote, which is that, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, right? I'm sure we've all heard this one. Has anyone heard the updated addition to it? Quite good. Those who intentionally block you from learning history intend to repeat it. Right? So it's not just a matter of willful ignorance, right? It's a matter of things that people are, right? This is I'm being a good philosophy teacher. I'm corrupting the youth. Ready? Here it comes. Okay. Anyone who tells you not to learn something, not to inquire about a piece of information, not to read something, not to look at something, right? Anytime information is denied to you, that is a red flag, right? The point is that if someone is able to defend their position, right, like we are in our papers, we should be open to the criticism, right? In fact, to make our position stronger, we need to address the criticism. Okay, so anytime someone tries to keep you in that isolated bubble, remember, it's a tactic, right? It's a tactic used to, right? I mean, it's true. The more you know, like, not with knowledge comes power. I'm saying all the cheesy things, all the one-liners today, but there are nuggets of truth in it, right? And it's exactly because of this, right? So yeah, if we encouraged the privileged individuals to know more about the experiences of those who are marginalized, of course they would change their behavior. So that's why the powers that be don't want it to happen, right? Let's keep them angry at the feminists and at women and scared of women, right? In order to make sure that they don't learn, right? Or that they continue to dismiss these types of things. Philosophers are going to say some different things about this. So I'm going to share the things that I think have been most helpful for me. And one of these things relates to something that hair ethicists are going to emphasize that none of the other theories do. Kong's a little bit acknowledges the role of family, right? But for the point of social harmony. For feminist care ethicists, it is about the relationships that we build with one another. And in terms of, making change, I don't want you to go out into the world trying to change other people, but I do think that change only occurs through interaction with other people. But I will say that I agree with like the Socratic method of, getting people to break down their defenses, right? You can't just go attacking people, telling them why they're wrong, right? There is something strategic about meeting people where they are. But there are also philosophers like Nietzsche, who is going to come up when we a little bit when we talk about existentialism. But he has a book that you might find helpful. It's called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is the figure from Zoroastrianism, but Nietzsche writes about him as just a literary figure in this case. But the whole point of the book is about him struggling between being his free self, right, and flourishing in all of the ways that a philosopher, right, is inclined to want to flourish, but recognizing that that's really impossible around other people, right? And so instead of the whole point then is to not fall into fatalism, right? We don't just want to give up. So the philosophers are going to be trying to give us some reason to keep going. And the idea here is that we should find that motivation either in setting the stage for future generations, right? So that sort of idea of like planting a tree, even if we don't get to sit under its shade, right? That even though we're not making huge bits, every little bit counts, right? We can't underestimate all of the work that has been done, right, to get to the point that we are. And even though it feels so immovable and maybe like we're losing progress and things are going backwards, right, we might be able to again gain confidence from human history and see how this is maybe part of that trend, right, part of the give and pull. On certain days, if I'm really optimistic, right, I want to think that this is like the last clawing death grip from, right, a generation that has wanted to continue that type of exclusivity. And I have faith in you all and younger generations to be better, but I think that we can only do that by not pretending like everyone who came before us is perfect, and acknowledging that we all have room to improve. So if we're going to take anything away from ethics, let it be that we can all do better. Okay, that none of us are perfect. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now. So next week, right, we are switching gears, moving on in our discussion of values. I think we're doing aesthetics next.